Okay, this is a quick sound test before we get the talk started. I'll just give it 20 seconds or so for the delay. We're on the holding screen, aren't we? In which case, I'm just going to start. Okay, this is a very quick sound check just before we get started. There's a 30-second delay, so you'll have to be patient just for a sec while we wait for that to come through. So I'll just stand here and look awkward for a minute. So we've got sound. Okay, right. We've got sound, so we're good to go. We've got a few people watching by the look of it, so thanks for those of you that have joined us tonight for a talk on otters. So I'm going to be talking about another animal, not a pine marten, you'll be surprised to hear. This is a talk that I've actually planned to do going around local branches and groups throughout the last few months, but obviously I haven't been able to because of the ongoing crisis. But this is proving to be a great way of at least reaching a few of our followers. So hopefully you all enjoy this talk tonight, and hopefully by the end of this you'll know a bit more about otters. Now, at the end of this session, there is an opportunity to ask questions, but what I'd normally do is ask for you just to put questions in the comments as we go. Today, though, it'd be really great we got inundated last time. We don't want to miss too many people off. So if you want to save your questions until the end, put them into the comments, and me and Tim here will go through the questions at the very end. So I'll talk for about half an hour, 40 minutes, and as I say, I'll allow for an extra 10 minutes or so for questions. Now, I'm going to remove my ugly mug from the main part of the screen, and we'll go on and just make sure that we can see that the full presentation. So we're just going to wait for that to transfer across to make sure that you can see what I can see. Now, it is a PowerPoint presentation. I'll be talking over the top of slides, so hopefully you'll all be able to see the slides. That it's a very, very visual presentation. How does that look, Tim? Okay, all good. Right, great stuff. So, as I mentioned, today we'll be talking about otters, and hopefully you'll get to know a little bit more about otters. Now, just to introduce myself as well, for those of you that don't know who I am, I'm the Communications Officer at Shropshire Wildlife Trust. Basically, that's my main job, but I'm also chair of Shropshire Mammal Group, and we collect mammal records from right the way across Shropshire, try and fill in like a mammal records map or an atlas of the county, so we know exactly what wildlife we've got out there to protect. But of course today we're going to be talking specifically about Lutra lutra. So Lutra lutra is the Eurasian otter, and very, very quickly, this is a brief physical description, and people are often surprised when they see photos or they get a chance to see an otter of just how long an otter's tail is. So they're easily spotted by their long, thin tail. They've got large webbed feet. If you see them in the water, obviously you don't see those webbed feet. They're busy paddling away under the surface. But if you're lucky enough to see them out of the water, you'll notice that they've got disproportionately large feet. And they've also got a smooth brown coat, and that coat is something that otters absolutely depend on. It's basically waterproof. It's two layers of fur, so they've got an outer layer which is the waterproof layer. Underneath that they've got some really fine guard hairs that trap oxygen, or air, and that acts as insulatory, particularly in colder climates and during the winter. That will keep them warm underwater. Otters spend a lot of time in rivers. As all pretty well aware. But because they're spending so much time in the cold waters, they also spend a lot of time looking after their coats. So this is actually a video that I shot back in 2011, so nearly 10 years ago now. I was lucky enough to come across a wild otter on the River Arrow in Herefordshire, and you can see that this is how an otter does a little bit of grooming and coat care. So they spend a lot of time grooming, looking after that coat to make sure it's in tip-top condition. I was very lucky to have seen an otter in such close proximity, and I'd like to say that I see otters like that all the time, but I really don't. That was by far, in 30 odd years looking for otters at that point, that was by far the closest and longest encounter with a wild otter I'd ever had. Now there is a bit of confusion with people often think that they've seen otters, but when what they've actually seen is American mink. American mink are much smaller than otters. They, like otters, will spend a lot of time in water. But if I go on to the next slide now, you can see, hopefully, that this is as proportionate as I could possibly get it on screen. But mink are about half the size of an otter. So an otter growing to quite impressive lengths, 1 metre to 1.3 metres long, and weighing anywhere from 10 kilos up to about 16 kilos. So we're talking about a big, heavy animal compared to a mink, which is about 1.5 kilos at most, and only about 35 to 45 centimetres in length. The other difference, so we mentioned before that the otters have got the smooth coat. Mink coats tend to be slightly fluffier, but they're also much more varying and they're in colour. So otters tend to always be that chocolatey brown colour, or chestnut brown. Mink can vary from like very light brown right the way through to black. And of course, otters were always in the UK, or at least as far back as the last ice age. Mink were actually introduced about 50 years or so ago now. So the mink from America has been released, and that has a much more detrimental impact on things, on our native wildlife species. Fish stocks particularly will be hit by mink, but they've also seen or caused a huge decrease in the number of some of our pretty iconic species like the water vole, which has declined by up to 95% because of things like mink that are able to predate them by getting into the burrows. Now, otters are much too big to get into waterfall burrows, so they're much less likely to have an impact on their population. Another distinguishing feature then, going back to the description of an otter, is otters, as I mentioned, they've got the smooth coat, long thick tail that they use to propel themselves through the water. They've also got really thick coarse whiskers, as you can see there, which is lacking on the mink. So mink have got small whiskers, but they're not as prominent, as pronounced as they are on the otter. And the otters use those to forage underwater, so they can actually, they're very sensitive to feel, so they can feel their way around using those whiskers and find food under the surface, and particularly in murky water. Now, Eurasian otters, although they're called Eurasian otters, they're actually the widest distributed otter species in the world. So they're distributed right the way from Ireland and the British Isles all the way across to the not far off Japan. So they cover a huge range, and they are just one of 13 or 14 different species. So there are subspecies of otters within there, but otters are pretty well spread right the way across the globe. So we've got our European otter, as I've mentioned before, 1 to 1.3 metres. But the biggest of the otters is the giant otter, which lives around the Amazon area, the Amazon basin, and is particularly, well, I'd like to say prolific. It was once very prolific in Peru. But like many of the otters and many of their other mustelid cousins, so the polecats, the badgers and the martins, they were heavily persecuted and unfortunately continue to be persecuted right the way across the world. Now, going back to our Eurasian or European otter, now in England they were actually quite common. Waterways, although they weren't always in tip-top condition, particularly after the last or the first industrial revolution, they were okay for otters. There was still plenty of fish around for them. Otters and fish and lots of other wildlife lived perfectly happily side by side. But then in 1955 there was the introduction of organochlorine pesticides, which of course led to a huge increase in the pollution of our waterways. And with that, we saw decreased fish stocks, so there was less food for otters to forage for. And the organochlorine actually affected the otters themselves, so it affected their ability to breed. It also built up in their system, reduced their life expectancy. So really from the mid-1950s, that there was then a huge decrease, anecdotally, of the number of otters that people were seeing. In 1979, so fast forward 24 years, and the first big National Otter Survey of England took place across waterways right the way across the country. And at that point, only just below 6% of the sites that were monitored were positive for otters. So it was widely acknowledged that otters were on the verge of decreasing to the point of extinction. And luckily it was recognised quite early on. So with that, otters in 1981 were given protected species status anyway under the 1981 Countryside Act. And then there were further surveys. So in 1986 we got the second survey of England, and already just over less than a decade, you've got an increase of about 4% in the number of sites where otters were present. Go forward another few years and you can see that there's a bit of a trend here. So we've gone from otters on the verge of extinction. By 1994, the third Otter survey found that 23.4% of sites in England were positive for otters. And there was also a survey, I don't know why I've got Wales in there, that's very confusing. But so this was specific to England. We're up to 36.3% of sites in England. And the most recent results were 10 years ago now, although there's ongoing research, but you can see that well over half of the sites surveyed were positive for otter signs, which it seems to be really good news for otters. We've gone from the verge of extinction to spreading back into pretty much every county of England. And there's no better way of representing this comeback than through the Otter survey map. So you can see this is the Otter survey from 1977 to 79, and the red dots represent positive otter records along waterways. And you can see that right through the central region of England, no otter sightings at all. Those otters were clinging on in places like Cornwall. In Shropshire specifically, otters were holding on to, particularly down in the southwest, and then over in the fenny areas of East Anglia. Now, fast forward again to 2009, 2010, and we look at the map, and it's certainly quite different from that original map. We can see that otters have not only clung on in those original places, but they've spread right the way across England. And at this point in time, 2020, I expect if we were to produce a map again, we'd see that there were even more red dots representing further positive records of otters. So it all seems to be good news as far as otters go. And of course, in conservation terms, that's a conservation good news story. And otters have often been represented, particularly over the last 20 years or so, as being that conservation success story. But I'll be talking a little bit more about some of the conflict as well that we've now started to see people encountering because of this increase in otter populations. I'll save that for a little bit later though. Now, one of the reasons that otters are doing so well in Shropshire, I'll be talking quite specifically throughout this talk about how otters are doing in Shropshire, but we're blessed with a lot of decent riparian, the river habitat, so that they'll inhabit fairly wide rivers, so they'll quite happily inhabit a river as big as the Severn, right the way down to little farm brooks. So I've encountered otters on brooks no more than 2 feet wide. So they are pretty adaptable as long as they've got somewhere they can create or find shelter and halts and of course food. So they're going to be moving around depending on where there's food. In Shropshire they'll also inhabit lake edges, and they'll fish out in the middle of lakes. And outside of Shropshire, of course, we associate Scotland with so much of our wildlife. That's where I would generally used to have gone to see otters. You guarantee to see otters up on the west coast of Scotland, where otters live in much higher density than they do anywhere else in the British Isles. And those otters on the coast, they're often mistaken as sea otters, but they are completely the same. They're lutra. There are river otters, are Eurasian otters, but they often get mistaken for the sea otters that actually live out on the Pacific coast of the United States and Canada. So it'd be great to have the Pacific coast otters, but we've just got, well, I say just, we're lucky enough to have otters thriving pretty much in all of the habitat that they would expect to be found in. Again, returning from the international otters to Shropshire specifically, one of the other reasons that we're seeing that there's an increase in otters, and otters never fully disappeared from Shropshire, was because we're blessed with lots of rivers. There's lots of rivers and streams. So this is one of the maps, just to give you an idea of the main rivers in Shropshire. And our rivers team have had this almost like an X-ray map of the county done to highlight exactly how many rivers and tributaries there are to those river systems and catchment areas. And you can see that there's not really many areas in Shropshire, apart from some of the higher land, where there aren't any waterways. So there's lots of really good habitat for otters in the county now. In terms of the habitat, they, as I say, they live in high density compared to what we find in Shropshire up on coastlines. Along riverways, otters live in pretty low density because they're largely solitary, and they're also very territorial, and that territorial behaviour is very much impacted by the amount of food that there is to forage in an area. So where there's not a huge amount of food, it's expected that an otter will cover a much bigger territory, and those average territories are around about 18 kilometres, but this is 18 kilometres of waterway as well. So it looks from like here, and that you get a lot of otters in Shropshire, that there's lots of space for them. But when you consider that all the waterways that I showed on the previous map, an individual otter might be inhabiting 18 kilometres or more of that waterway, they're still living in very low density. So there's not thousands and thousands of otters out there. People do often mistake individual otters from one another, so it is quite to think there's a lot more otters out there than there are. Like other wild mammals in the county, otters don't have a set breeding season, so they will breed all year round, pretty much depending on their sexual maturity, their condition, and of course their ability to find suitable mates. And when the when they do mate, the male has a bigger territory than a female, but during the time the female's giving birth to the cubs, that territory will tend to overlap. If not, a smaller female territory will be incorporated within a larger male territory. And the males are much more territorial than females, and they'll certainly fight off or chase off any other male otters that venture into their territory, because of course they're trying to protect their food source, which is their means of survival. And while I'm talking about otter diet, so let's just introduce you to the wonderful diet of otters, which is quite an eclectic diet. So they'll eat things as we associate them with, like the fish. They'll also eat nymphs and larvae of things like dragonflies. A large part of the diet, particularly this year, is there's the emergence of the young frogs and toads from frog spawn and toad spawn. You'll get them feeding a lot on amphibians, including great crested newts, but they don't realise that they're a European protected species, so we can let them off for that. They're also going to be feeding on freshwater mussels. Now we've got signal crayfish, which again are another species that have been introduced from North America, but there's a lot of those out there that they've kind of pushed out our and killed off our native white-clawed crayfish, but there's good evidence, particularly in the areas around Bridge North, that where there's a lot of signal crayfish, the otter poo that I found contains a lot of signal crayfish, so the otters could actually be doing us a favour in hopefully controlling the population of the signal crayfish too. They'll also eat waterfowl, small mammals like rats, but not, as I mentioned, it's very rare that you would find evidence of otters eating water voles. And they'll also go for eels, but of course eels were a big part of the otter diet historically, but eel populations have plummeted, and they've really been affected by the decreasing quality of water and the decreasing quality of our water systems. Adding to that, they'll also go for things like small fish, sticklebacks, and little tiny fish called bullheads that are literally 2.5 inches long, and they'll spend a lot of time foraging for these little creatures. And at this point, I'm talking about otters that are in a healthy natural ecosystem. So the natural lakes, meres of North Shropshire, and of course the streams. Now, when I was referring earlier on to the otter surveys traditionally were based on otter field science. It would be a case of people walking along waterways, watercourses, canals even, looking for things like otter spraint or otter footprints. Sorry, I've gone out of order there. Holts, so a holt being like an otter shelter or an otter home. Slides and feeding sites, so where there's sites where there's bits of fish and things left over, we'd know that there's been otters around. So I'd say the easiest one, if you get your eye in and you get otters walking through black ink and you end up with a nice clear footprint like this, they'd be quite easy to identify, because they have the prominent 5 digits show on their prints generally. But of course, not all otters walk through black ink and then walk nicely across some white paper. You don't end up with these nice clear prints. What you're much more likely to end up with is this. And depending on the substrate that they're walking through, if they're walking through sand, like in the case on the left-hand side, you end up with slightly distorted toes, but you can generally make out there's still 5 toes visible there. And their prints are quite round in appearance compared to a dog, which is quite elongated or oblong in appearance. Otters are quite round. In softer substrate like the fine river sediment on the right hand side, they will also have their claws show, so they've got quite prominent claws. They don't always show up, but then a lot of people expect that because otters have got the web feet, that the webbing will show up as well, but they actually close their toes when they're on dry land, so that webbing doesn't always show up. So you can identify that there's otters around by the footprints, and you can make a positive record of an otter using a water course based on those footprints. If you take a photo of them, it's always good to take a photo of an otter print or any kind of mammal footprint with something in there for scale, so that we can see exactly how big the footprint is. So from footprints to Spraint. So otter spraint is, for anybody that doesn't know, otter poo or otter scat. Now we refer to most other mustelids and carnivores as producing scat. That's the name that we give to their feces. Otters have got a special name for theirs, spraint, which it derives from the original French term, the French for express. So that has basically evolved over the years, and it's basically referring to the way in which they produce their spraint. So it's very much an expression of their character and behaviour. It's also shot out at high velocity, but I'll get onto a little bit more about how useful spraints are and why they may be using those to express their characters too. You can see that spraints are generally quite distinctive. The most distinguishing feature of spraint is that you tend to find lots of crushed up bones, bird feathers if they're being eaten, ducks and waterfowl, and they tend to eat the whole lot. They've got really powerful jaws, and if you wanted to really take it seriously, become a full otter detective, you'd also want to give that thing a sniff. And if it smells like, to me, it smells mostly like tea, like herbal tea. It's not a bad smell. Jasmine tea, to me, all you need to do is make some jasmine tea tonight, give it a sniff, and that's exactly, to me, what otter spraint smells like. You wouldn't think that it smells sweet when they're eating things like fish and frogs, but the smell of fish is only ever very slight in otter spraint. Now, when you're looking for otter spraint, you can look for prominent spots. So otters often return to spraint sites because they're using these spraints. They're not just going to the toilet as we might. These are much more complex behaviours. So otters are leaving these spraints as territorial markers. They're also leaving them as messages to other otters if they want to attract in mates, to say hi. There's a male in the area. Should a female pass through and come across the spraint, and they're quite commonly found along waterways on things like rocks, prominent rocks, logs. They'll show up on even tufts or mounds of sedges and rushes. But you don't always have to look along watercourses. Now, this is actually an otter spraint that I came across a good 50 or 60 metres away from a watercourse. And one of the things, as we've seen an increase in the number of otters, is, of course, otters are very adaptable creatures, and they don't always have to follow watercourses. If they learn there's another source of food that they can access by leaving that watercourse. So what we've often found is where there's a spraint located somewhere well away from a watercourse, it's normally en route to a pond or something that may be absolutely rammed full of fish, which is of course going to attract an otter. Now, one of the best places I've found, or one of the most productive places for finding otter spraints, has been at bridges. This isn't always the case, and it tends to be, again, they're geographically variable. Now, in Shropshire, 82% of bridges that I looked at last year had actually got otter spraint underneath, and whether or not that's because the otters are particularly switched on, they know that if they're not going to be returning to that site to refresh their scent for quite a while. So maybe they're trying to protect it from the weather by placing them under bridges, but it's actually more likely, as clever as they are, that they're also using easy to get at places that humans aren't necessarily going to easily come across. And lots of bridges have got nice ledges that make ideal little spots, prominent spots for otters to go to the toilet and scent mark. So it's always worth looking under bridges. I'm in Shrewsbury at the moment, they're just a few hundred metres away from Asda, and there's a bridge just over the Ray Brook there. And on the ledge under that bridge, there's always otter spraints when the water level drops nice and low at this time of the year. So even in urban areas like this, we've got otters passing through and scent marking. And then further along the Ray Brook as well, we often conduct our surveys along the brook in our wellies, looking for spraints under those bridge systems. And as I say, they're generally pretty productive when it comes to finding the spraint. Now, the spraint is a great way of adding those otter records to the overall map, so we know exactly how well distributed otters are across the county. But they're also really useful in terms of finding out what otters are eating in any given area. Now, what we can do with otter spraint is soak it in detergent for a while and sieve out all of the nasty stuff, and we can actually take out individual bones, as this picture shows. So we can sieve out the bones and look at those through a microscope and get ID of all of the species the otters have been eating at that particular time. And you can see when we get in nice and close, we've got things like stickleback bones and minnows that once you get your eye and you start to notice. I must admit, I don't spend as much time doing that as I used to, but it is quite time consuming. But when you do get into it, it's actually surprisingly addictive. And there are guides out there, so I often take lots of photos myself, but they're not always great quality. But there are guides by the Mammal Society that you can look at to hopefully help you identify those those fish bones or frog bones or anything else, and they're varying in degrees of difficulty. So the carp ribs are fairly easy to identify because they're so big and thick. But then when you consider that we've got carp, the otters are eating bullheads, little fish, they're eating frogs, trout, salmon, ducks, the crayfish, then newts, voles, bird chicks, eels, and all of the other fish species that we have in waterways as well. That's just a bit of an idea of the species that they're going for. So they're omnivorous and opportunists. So they will whatever they come across in the greatest density, that will make up their diet at that particular moment in time. But that does add a bit of difficulty when you come to analysing their spraint, of course, because there's a lot of different bones to be looking through. But at some point we'll do a spraint analysis thing online. We're hoping to use a little like USB microscope that we can use to show like live from an otter spraint tray, which is something for everybody to look forward to later in the year. Right, so from the grossness of otter spraint, we've always got to talk about scat at some point in my talks. I'm sorry, it just comes as standard these days. But we also we can be talking about some of the other field signs. In this case, I'm not going to be talking about slides and couches that we associate as slides and couches. Now, in the world of otters, a slide is very different, and it's a great way of indicating the presence of otters. And where an otter is in a fairly small territory, they'll often use the same slides to get into the river. So the slide being an access point into the watercourse. And in this image, I just wonder if I can point it out. It's probably quite difficult to do that, but there is a slide hidden just under the fern there. So there is a slide well hidden, and they are quite difficult to spot when, particularly at this time of the year, when the vegetation cover is quite heavy. But going into the autumn, as the vegetation dies back a little bit, it's much easier to spot those slides, and you'll see that there's an area where the vegetation is brushed towards the water regularly. And otters, I've never seen it in Shropshire, but I've been lucky enough in Scotland to see young otters and mum otters using the slide repeatedly, but not just as an access point. That they're actually very playful creatures. So they will repeatedly slide down into the water, particularly on mudslides, and they run back up and then keep going backwards and forwards and playing on them. So the slides are practical, but they're also a means of entertaining themselves. Now, when a slide or an otter access point is being regularly used, the vegetation it rubs away completely, so you end up with this nice clear muddy patch. And at this point, this is a lake in Staffordshire. There was actually otter prints, and the otters were inhabiting quite a small territory there, so there were loads of prints going in and out, and they were literally at this point once or twice a night, hence the massive gap in the grass cover at that point. Returning briefly to the west coast of Scotland, the coastal otters up that way will often have what we call a couch. So a couch is somewhere that an otter will lie up there. They'll also look after their coats, like in the video that I showed you earlier, where the otter's rubbing itself on the grass. They'll often do that to condition their coat, and we call those a couch, but they're quite adaptable. They'll find grassy rocky tussocks, grassy tussocks in rock up in Scotland on the coast. But you also, of course, get otters over in the fenny areas of East Anglia, and in those areas, otter couches can be quite big, but we're talking about an area of flattened reed which could be easily 2 meters long. And we know that they're otter couches because otters often leave their own spraints all over those areas, and they often urinate in the area, so they tend to be quite a strong smelling, similar smell to the otter spraint area. So you'd know that there's been an otter around based on the aromas coming from that area. In Shropshire, they'll also use like grassy river banks, so along the River Severn, there's huge sections where it's very difficult for humans to get to. and the otters are likely to have those couches tucked away well out of human prying eyes. Those are some of the field signs that you could physically look for, and that of course was the traditional method of identifying that you've got otters in an area. And those initial surveys that were conducted from 1979 were conducted based on what they called the 100-metre transect survey, and that would be a group of volunteers walking along the riverbank for 100 metres and identifying whether or not there were physical otter signs along that stretch of river. Of course, now things are much easier because of the advent of camera trap technology. So our camera traps are proven to be really beneficial to our otter monitoring, but of course it's not just the otters that we're getting clips of. We're also finding lots of other animals that we didn't realise we had here in such good numbers. Now I've put this slide in just to show that it can be a little bit risky if you're putting camera traps out on a stick on the banks of the River Severn, as I did here. This is at Preston Montford, and obviously we all know that the River Severn rises and falls quite rapidly, and this is a camera trap that was actually a good 3 or 4 foot above the water. Do you think that's an internet issue?
It could be. Do you think that?
No, it's okay at this side. Ethernet. Right. Okay, right. I think we're back. There was just a temporary internet issue, but I think we're back and broadcasting now. Tim will give me the thumbs up, so I'll carry on talking and assume that you can hear me okay. So I was talking about what happens to camera traps if you put them out too close to the River Severn. It's going okay now? Yeah. Right, okay. Yeah, it appears that the internet's going a little bit wobbly, so apologies for any issues with the sound or picture quality. What I can always do is actually re-record this later in the week and upload a full version of it if anybody's had trouble watching it tonight. I've also I've tried to get camera traps as far away from the river as possible, so I've put them up on awkward banks and cliffs and in gorges. And the first time I ever got otters was 10 years ago now, actually. And this was a very, very brief clip on that camera trap, which was the Bushnell Trophy cam. Just a very, very brief clip of a couple of otters. That was enough to get me hooked to camera trapping for otters. And that one camera trap became my trusty otter cam. So I put it out on several places, this being near Newport, Preston, on the Weald Moors. And we found that on the Spraint Brook there, the otters seemed to be doing quite well. It was a good sign that there was good stocks of fish and other things for them to feed on. But it's not just the obvious places that I've put camera traps. I've also been called out to put a camera trap in a storm drain in Cardinal Valley. So this is a drain under Newpool Reservoir. That there was lots of otter spraint showing up on a rock right at the end of the tunnel. So I put a camera trap out there, not expecting there to be an otter around at all. But lo and behold, there was in fact a big old healthy looking or old looking male dog otter. So the dogs are the male otters. A female otter is called a bitch otter. But that was quite surprising that otters were venturing well away from watercourses, and of course that it gives us the question, why was the otter going up there? There was no source of food as far as we could see. There was no fish, no lying water for anything to be living in. The only thing that was up there other than otters were bats, and it was possible that otter was going up there every so often when to coincide with the bat roosts. So what I hopefully wanted to do, that I tried to do, was go back to collect some Spraint once I realised that there'd been an otter in there. only to return a few weeks later to find that there'd been a massive storm and all of that otter spraint had washed away, and we were never successful at getting the otter back to see if he'd been eating bats from that area. Now, the first time I ever got a whole family of otters again was down at Preston Montford on the River Severn. But you can see, I'm going to show the evolution of the camera traps in a minute. This is quite usual behaviour of otters. If there's a couple of cubs around, or it's a group of otters, or a romp of otters being the collective noun, that tends to be a mum and her cubs. So the mum will basically care for the cubs for a good 18 months or so, if not 2 years after birth, just to train the kits up, or the cubs up, in finding all the best foraging grounds and being able to traverse their way around the complicated, or navigate their way around the river systems. But it's great that camera traps were picking up the like full family units of otters on the River Severn, considering how polluted the River Severn was just half a century ago. So it's really encouraging that we could see that a species like the otter was making a comeback. Now these otters again were showing up on a camera trap that somebody else had informed me of about 10 miles away, and they'd said that they were seeing dozens and dozens of otters. On closer inspection, it was actually the same 3 otters, so the mum and two cub otters, that was inhabiting that full section of watercourse. And the chap was actually started to realise from his own camera trapping that he was seeing repeatedly the same otter family, and it wasn't just dozens of otters passing through. And otters, as I mentioned, show up in places that you don't expect them to show up. So this is at the end of somebody's garden down in the Kempton area. And this is a really small brook, probably only just under a metre wide, and really shallow. It's literally half a foot deep. But there was surprisingly an otter coming up and sprinting on the steps at the end of somebody's garden. But that was on an old camera trap called an acorn, which is a camera trap that I used quite heavily up until about 3 or 4 years ago. And you can see I upgraded my camera trap a while later, and you can see if it will play the difference in quality then. Exactly the same place, but the same camera, different camera trap. No, it's not playing. But you can see the quality just on the steps there, that the quality is vastly improved. And it's not enjoying playing video now. So this, just to explain it, it's a bit of an odd looking setup, but this is basically a raft with a camera trap on. So the idea of this raft was that I would have a camera trap floating out into the middle of the River Severn. It's a raft about a metre long, and all I wanted to do was take advantage of the inquisitive nature of otters. I thought if there was something floating in the river, that I might be able to encourage the individuals to go onto that raft so I could get nice close-up footage. So there's a camera trap on here with a close focus lens, and what I hadn't taken into account that summer, 2017, is it was particularly dry, so we were verging on drought for a while, and the water levels of the River Severn dropped right down. And when I returned to the raft, the river was about 3 or 4 feet below the raft, and the whole thing was suspended on the riverbank. But you can see that an otter did end up on there, despite it not actually being floating out in the river. He did come to investigate. But it wasn't just the otters that found it. We did also get a mink show up on there. But that's quite a useful tool there to show the difference in size between otters and mink. So otter in that clip there, and then a mink visiting it here. And at this point, the water levels had obviously improved, so that the thing was actually floating out on the river as it was designed to do. And another mink there. It's bizarre, it's not playing any videos now. It's a bit worrying. And this is one of our sites not far away from Otters Stream. And this is an area where we'd often seen otter spraint show up, but we weren't seeing a huge amount of other evidence of there being otter activity. And it turned out because the otters were actually inhabiting and halting up in an area that was pretty inaccessible to humans. So just by putting the camera trap in there, we found out that there were otters in using an area that we had no idea they were hanging around. We thought they'd ventured off much further afield than this. And again, you can see during the daytime there, when there's not humans around, otters are quite comfortable coming out to hunt and play around during the day. And one of the reasons for their largely nocturnal behaviour is because of the fact they were so heavily persecuted. And even going back as far as the 16th and 15th century, there were records of hunts for otters with otter hounds. And in the Complete Angler, Isaac Newton actually refers to his encounter with the otter hounds, and as a keen angler himself, he was always delighted to see otters on the river, but he was quite shocked at the butchery of otters that he encountered from the use of otter hounds. And of course that impacted their behaviour. They started to become much more nocturnal, so it's quite rare to see otters out during the day. But of course, as they become more relaxed around human activity, there's much more chance of them becoming bold. And you can see the otters, once they used the camera trap, they just behave perfectly normal, exactly the same spot over and over again. And the great thing is about this camera trap footage, of course, is it's really engaging. So when in the past I've done like little group sessions, training sessions with camera traps and mammal monitoring, there's nothing more exciting than checking the camera trap that's been monitoring something like an otter that most of these people that have come into Shropshire from further afield, they've never encountered wild otter signs before, but to actually see the otter there that's left that spraint or the footprint right on camera trap is really exciting for groups to see. You can see here we've got look at it, I'm afraid to say, but the camera traps, as I mentioned, have picked up otters on numerous watercourses right the way across the county, and it gives the impression that otters are faring fairly well. And this was actually a clip of an otter grooming. I'm just going to... it's because QuickTime has failed, apparently. That's weird. It was working fine before. It's saying QuickTime's not available. Well, that's it for most of the camera trap clips now. But just to give you an idea of the full picture, over 60% of our records going into the Mammal Group and the Otter monitoring scheme at Shropshire Wildlife Trust are from camera traps and not just from the field science. The camera traps really are essential bits of kit. And this one works. Okay, that's good. Other people are obviously getting the camera trap records of otters, and this has been sent in by John Crook, so thanks to John for sending this through, of otters feeding and hunting, or coursing is the behaviour term, of them turning, flipping up rocks and basically sniffing around, using those whiskers to detect fish that are hiding under rocks. And John's also had quite a lot of success monitoring the otters, just making use again of those prominent spots there to leave Spraint deposits. So it's thanks to these camera traps, these bits of kit, that we're getting a lot more, a much better understanding of otters, particularly in Shropshire. But as I say, otters are very geographically variable. So the picture at the moment from camera trap clips of otters in Shropshire, you can see that they're pretty well distributed right the way across the county. But because they're showing up on lots of watercourses and they've increased in numbers, of course, like anything, this predatory becomes some kind of conflict, unfortunately. And otters are getting a bad time of it, and anglers are getting a bad time of it from otters. Because it's very difficult at the moment for both to coexist. And there's been obviously an increase in the number of otters over the last couple of decades, but At the moment, there's also over 1 million anglers in the UK, and that's a huge number of people just to ignore. So what I'm really keen to do is make sure that we work as closely as we can with anglers to hear their concerns, and also to dispel some of the myths that might be out there. That there is always a little bit of mythology involved in the kind of anecdotal evidence of wildlife. And our rivers team too are doing lots of work with landowners, angling groups, which I'll talk a little bit very briefly about as we go on. But overall, there's no evidence in the UK to support the claims that this increase in otters is damaging fish populations, and that's in healthy river ecosystems or natural ecosystems, so the lakes, the streams and the brooks. But of course, there's an increase in the amount of conflict with commercial fisheries in particular, and I've witnessed firsthand just how upsetting it is to a fishery owner to lose a few £1,000s worth of 30-year-old carp. It's obviously a really tough situation for them to be in. But there's also quite a few myths that I've heard from reading things online as well. On social media, there's various groups that have targeted otters as being the main cause of the reduction in fish numbers. But the difficulty is now that watercourses are very much in a different place to how they were when otters were originally doing particularly well back in the prior to the 1955 introduction of organochlorines. And while the otters were low in number, of course, that angling and fishery business has increased tenfold, particularly during the last 20 years. So the watercourses and our use of water, not just in England, but right the way across the globe, has very much changed compared to how it used to be. And there's much more demands on it also from other predators. So I've mentioned that we've got mink that will also be adding to that reduction of fish numbers. But we've also got an increase in cormorants that are making more use there. They're coming inland from the coastal areas to take advantage of the meals that they'll get from hunting along watercourses. And we've got increases in other things that might be impacting those fish populations. But there are a couple of myths. So there's often things put out on social media saying that conservationists have been releasing otters into the wild for decades now, but the reality is between about 1985 and 1999 there were 117 otters released, mainly over on the east coast where otter numbers really were quite low. Now in the west part of the UK, so Shropshire being one of those counties, and Devon and Cornwall also being they continue to be otter strongholds, and they've always had otters there. So there haven't been the big releases of otters that people often accuse conservation groups of conducting. But there were releases, and whether or not those were completely well thought out, it's only now that we can look back and see how successful those the conservation projects have been, and we can learn from those projects and any glitches that people came across along the way. So there haven't been any releases in Shropshire. There was just the natural population of otters in the county already. Another thing that another accusation against otters that's often put out there is that they have a huge impact on fish stocks in healthy ecosystems. But of course they didn't prior to the 1950s. Otter populations and fish populations was always quite high and healthy if the ecosystem was in good condition. Otters are often blamed for taking out the like breeding age fish and targeting like pregnant carp and some of the coarse fish. But otters actually also feed on, from looking at Spraint, again this is why analysing Spraint is so key, they're eating a lot more small fish than people realise, so less than 30 centimetres in length. And generally because they're opportunists, they're moving around quite often along a big territory. They're unlikely, again on a healthy open ecosystem, they're unlikely to have a huge impact on the populations of other species that they're predating, because they're covering such a big area and they live in such low density. But again, I'm referring here to what is happening in Shropshire, but watercourses might be in a totally different condition. There might be much less food for otters in other regions of England. So they're very, very geographically variable. But of course, the big thing to remember is that we can accuse otters of causing lots of issues, but there's still not enough research being done, and we don't yet know everything about otters. And as I mentioned, otters are very individual in their behaviour, so it's very difficult to predict the actions of an otter. But there are always solutions out there, of course, and the conservation groups have been working with the Angling Trust, and a few years back now, DEFRA did make some funding available to the Angling Trust to pay particularly commercial fisheries to give them money so they could put in otter-proof fencing. I'll talk a little bit more very briefly about that in a second. It's great that the Angling Trust and other angling groups have also recognised that one of the best ways to get our fish stocks back to healthy levels is to restore river habitats back to their former glory. Now, the healthier a river habitat is, the much better it is for the fish, the otters, and everything else that depends on that habitat. Back in 2016, the Wild Otter Trust secured licences to humanely trap and relocate otters that had been caught within fenced-off fisheries. Now, again, I'll talk a little bit about the fenced-off fisheries in just a moment. I'll have to get moving. I've been chatting for ages. I lost track of time. Sorry, Tim. There's obviously more research being conducted. So I mentioned previously that research is the key. We need to do as much research as possible to see exactly what's happening right the way across England. And in Shropshire, we've got a really proactive rivers team. So the rivers team are out there speaking to landowners. They're working with fishing groups. Anybody that owns stretches of water stretches of land along watercourses are working with us to improve the quality of their land. Just from cutting down the amount of agricultural runoff into rivers can have a huge impact on fish stocks, because then there's less like silt and things muddying up the waters, which affect the breeding success of fish populations. So there are things that we can do, but as you can see from this, it's all about getting those ecosystems into a good, healthy balance. Now, I've been talking about healthy natural ecosystems, but of course what is very different is the massive influx in enclosed fisheries. So trout fisheries in particular have become big business. There's also commercial coarse fishing lakes out there that people have invested a lot of money in. And of course, for an otter that may be struggling to find food on its natural watercourse, they're getting into a pool that's absolutely packed to the gunwales with fish is just a free meal. It's asking for trouble. As soon as an otter gets in there, it's just an absolute feast for an otter. And there's not a huge amount that can be done to deter an otter other than trying to protect the fishery as best as possible by putting in fairly expensive fencing. And that there are grants, as I mentioned, available from DEFRA for the fencing, but it's not always practical, and again, more research needs to be done to find out how to make this fencing as affordable as possible without hitting the bottom line of the people that run the fisheries. And we completely sympathise with the fishery owners that may be losing stock, but we also want to find a balance what benefits everybody and will benefit the wildlife itself. And this is a case study of a fishery that I've had the joy of working with over the last couple of years. It's actually a coarse fishing, so a hobby fishing pool down in the Shropshire Hills. And the guys that have bought it, they absolutely love angling, but they also love wildlife, and they really want to get the balance right. So they were getting quite frustrated that they'd spent all of this money and time putting in otter fencing, but they were putting out a camera trap and finding that there was evidence of an otter playing around inside their enclosure, and it was a complete mystery to how this otter could have been getting in. They'd done everything right with the fencing, and the otter just kept showing up. Every time it looked like it had disappeared for a while, it then showed up again and left big piles of Spraint like this. So lots of field signs that it was there. But very unfortunately, it was also predating some of their really expensive fish that they were stocking into the lake, and it was causing thousands of pounds worth of damage to the fish stocks in this particular pool. And they'd done everything right by putting the fencing in, but it just wasn't working. It just wasn't apparently keeping the otter out, and it was a complete mystery to me. I covered every section of the fence. We looked for burrows and any ways in. Every single pipe that went from the other side of the fence from watercourses into the enclosure were blocked off, so that there's no way that otters could get in there. And it was actually quite frustrating. I wanted to find a solution that would benefit the fishermen and, of course, the otter. And it'll go on to the next slide. Yeah. And you can see that this is the otter just around the edge of the fence. Again, it apparently disappeared for a while, but then it showed up on the inside of the enclosure. So incredibly frustrating. And as I walked around the lake, I started to find there were huge Spraint sites, so the literal big piles of Spraint piled up on like the prominent tree stumps and roots. And it looked like the otter had actually been trapped in there. So I put my own camera trap out and indeed found that there was regular footage of an otter. It didn't always show up every night, but it seemed to show up every so often, which gave the impression that it was probably trapped in the enclosure. And at that point, it was possible that we could just get somebody in there from the Environment Agency to try and trap and remove that otter. But what I'd suggested to start with was just leaving the gate open, see if the otter might go out, and hopefully would show on the camera trap if it came back in. Just to finish that story quickly, so I realise I've been going on for an hour. In the end, the otter seemed to have disappeared. We didn't know where it had gone, whether or not it was going to come back. But then a few months ago, the otter showed up in the enclosure again, despite all of the work that the team had put into to try and make it otter-proof. And it's only from somebody then reporting the gate being left open by some anglers that were going down there late at night, and they were having a few drinks and leaving the gate wide open, which was of course allowing the otter straight in. And so the solution there, of course, is that they did everything right. It's just been to make sure that they enforce the closure of the gates to stop the otters being able to freely go in. So there are ways of deterring otters and keeping them out, but we do have to be aware of their conservation status and their protection. And they are protected species, so we can't really disturb otter halts or trap otters without having a license. It's completely illegal to disturb otters and their habitat. So it's worth taking that into account if people do have anything they see as an issue with an otter. But of course, we're still doing research, so it's always really useful if you send in your otter sightings. So the more we hear from other people, the more camera trap footage we get for a start, the more we can get an idea of exactly what otters are getting up to in Shropshire. So please do send records to the Shropshire Otter Recording Scheme. Now there is a link there in that that I don't think is visible on the main screen, but if you Google Shropshire Otter Recording Screen, you'll see that there's a way of making records, and you can also send records into the Shropshire Mammal Group, and we will share all those records and make sure that all of your otter records are logged. And if anybody is interested, we have now also started, it's not a full online shop at the moment, but you are able to look at a catalogue of things that we're selling in the shop, including these lovely cute otters. But I've been talking about camera traps a lot, so we've got these are the Browning Recon Forces, so these are my recommended camera traps at the moment. And you can basically order these over the phone, so if you phone between 9 and 5, ask for Lizzie, and you'll be able to order those directly from us. And of course that's hugely beneficial for us as a way of raising money, so we can continue our things like the otter research, but we can also continue our habitat management improvements and trying to restore nature at a county-wide and landscape level. So any support that we get from anybody that watches these talks is always gratefully accepted. Now, that's me on otters for now, but I've got Tim just writing down a few questions. I'll answer a few questions, but I'm very aware that I've been going on for quite a while, so I'll just answer a few. Oh, right, okay. Oh, the right one. We've got a full email from Sarah Matthews. So, oh, right, okay. I'll answer the first one. I don't. Any other questions, Tim, to be aware of? Oh, great stuff. Okay, that's you've given me an easy time tonight. So, Sarah asks, how is the fur adapted to be warm but also waterproof without getting damp and heavy? This is because of their dual layered coats. The warm guard hairs that are underneath the fluffy hairs, they don't actually come into contact with the water. The outer hairs actually form a really tight seal as soon as the water goes over the otter, as soon as the otter goes into the water. So they're basically able to get out, dry off their outer coat and maintain the waterproofing on the outer layer. So Sarah also says, I've read otters taste with an air bubble blown carefully into food. Is this common to all otter species? Again, there's not a huge amount of research on this internationally, but it's thought that otters they've got an incredibly good sense of smell, but they will certainly they've been observed on underwater cameras in the UK, down on the rivers in Devon, as you say, blowing an air bubble in the water, and they're able to detect scent particles within that. So yes, they can, we believe now, smell underwater, which is quite impressive. Do otters have an ancestral predecessor linking them with badgers, as they are both mustelids? Yep, so as Sarah points out there, otters and badgers are both members of the mustelid family, so they do share that common ancestor going back well over 6 million years or so ago now. And the otters obviously adapted physically to their riparian habitat, whereas the badgers and other mustelids adapted to the land and the dry areas. And yes, Sarah, you can share this wherever you like. That's absolutely fine. Okay, any other questions, Tim? Okay, well, thank you for going easy on me tonight. I was expecting lots of emails saying that I supporting the release of otters, but I'm glad that nobody has said anything about that, because of course we definitely haven't. So thanks for listening. Our next talk is next week, and that's with Kath Price. Dr. Kath will be talking about her experiences as a paleozoologist. And beyond that, we've also got talks on the Northwest Relief Road and some of the work that our Rivers team are doing over the next few months. So thanks for listening, and we will leave it for now. Cheers. Is that stopped?